All right, I want to talk about weed seeds and manure and how to manage some of the key weeds that we get in our manure is what I'm going to cover here today. So one of the big weeds that we have to deal with these days is waterhemp, one of the pigweed species, something that we need to be very concerned about. So here's some ways that waterhemp seeds may move and cause problems in our fields. The number one way is through water. There was a research study done once that within 20 minutes after a rain event, they captured 1 million pigweed seeds. 1 million pigweed seeds in 20 minutes after a rain event. So they move very easily with water. I know when I was in North Dakota, I got to see this firsthand because the town that I live by, the river, when it floods in the spring with the snow melt, would separate and go on the west side of town, which it shouldn't go on. And suddenly they had waterhemp on the west side of town that was resistant to glyphosate that they didn't have the year before because somebody upstream had the resistant waterhemp. So they clearly move in water. Not all weed seeds move in water, but clearly waterhemp does very easily. Machinery is another good way to move waterhemp seeds. We know this based on the Palmer amaranth issues that we have. Harvesting equipment, tillage, and even mowing can help to cause issues with weed seed spread. Another issue is feed, which equates into the manure that we haul from our feed into the fields. So we need to be worried about that. And birds are another avenue. I'll show you some data on how birds move seeds, and then we ourselves can move seeds by moving soil or equipment around or with our ATVs, whatever. We have an opportunity to move those around. And then wind is not very big of an issue for waterhemp in particular, but certainly some weeds like mare's tail or horseweed is certainly an issue for that. So here are the feed sources that could be problems for waterhemp and other weed species. Hay, especially the second and the fourth cuttings of hay would be an issue, or second to the fourth. Obviously, waterhemp's not going to be up early in the season, so we don't have to worry about it then, but it could be an issue later on. We certainly know that we've got Palmer amaranth that has come into this state from hay in other states where Palmer amaranth is grown, so we certainly can have that as an issue. Corn stalks, if you're feeding corn stalks, harvesting those, you can harvest the waterhemp plants and cause an issue with that. Silage, that's probably the biggest issue is corn silage, but not all the waterhemp is mature at that time of the year yet, so that's a positive thing. Soybean meal, the soybean meal is heated up to 150 to 180 degrees, and that's not always enough. If it gets to 180, you're probably going to kill most weed seeds, but at 150, you're not killing all weed seeds. So it depends on the process of the soybean meal as to what that temperature is as to whether you're killing the weed seeds. Cottonseed meal, again, that's how the Palmer amaranth got here to begin with, and then just other feed products that we have that we're feeding also. So one of the things is, the question is can pelletized feeds cause an issue with weeds? And the answer is that 2% of weed seeds survived grinding and pelletization. So even pelletizing is not enough to destroy all weed seeds. They're still going to get through that feed process. And then 11% of random pelletized feed samples had viable weed seeds. So you can have up to 11% weed seeds that are viable in your feed even though it's pelletized. So there's certainly a source there for that to occur. What about what happens to the weed seeds after they go through the livestock? Are those seeds non-sterile anymore, or are they still viable? Well, here's some research here. In one study, almost 25% of the weed seeds recovered in swine and cattle manure. So 25% of the weed seeds were recovered, and of those 25% of them germinated. All right? So that's a decent amount of seeds, especially if you take into account waterhemp and how many seeds it can produce if it happens to be resistant and you're spraying herbicides that are leaving them survive. Another area of research showed that 10 to 12% of weed seeds were recovered in horse and sheep manure. So it's not just relegated to swine and cattle. And again, 25% of that captured seed germinated as well. 2% of weed seeds were recovered in chicken manure, so not very many. The problem is, though, with the gizzards, it really scratched up the seeds in the case of velvet leaf and made them more viable. All right, so we didn't have as many, but it made it more viable. Fresh dairy manure was collected from 20 different farms in another study. They found 13 different grass species and 35 different broadleaf species in that manure. All right, that's a lot of different weed seeds. And so you can see that it's not just one particular species that's causing a problem. 50% of the samples had lamb's quarter seed. Lamb's quarters is a weed that will survive for many years as a seed, 100 years or more. So you can see that you're going to be adding those to the seed bank and causing issues. We had 35% yellow foxtail, 30% dandelion and common chickweed, 25% wild mustard, red root pigweed, and barnyard grass. So those were the species that were found in that particular study. And in one farm, they found 364,000 seeds per ton of manure, with an average of 68,000 seeds per ton. That's a lot of weed seeds that you're spreading back out onto the field and adding problems that you have to deal with. And there were 4 farms that had no weed seeds at all in that particular study. So the question has always come up is, will ensilene kill the weed seeds? And the answer is, it will kill grass species. It does a very effective job, but it does not kill all broadleaf species. You can see that 3% of the lamb's quarter survived, 30% of the wild buckwheat survived, and 6% of the red root pigweed survived. So we're not getting rid of all of the seeds when we put it in the silo. What about digesters? What happens with the weed seeds that go through the digesters? In this one particular study, not all the seeds were killed. It says 1, 12, and 16% of red root pigweed, lamb's quarters, and velvet leaf germinated after anaerobic digestion, compared to 5, 18, and 12% without digestion. So again, very similar whether you had digestion or not, with the amount of weed seeds that were left behind that were viable. So that's not a method that's going to kill weed seeds. Composting. Most weed seeds should be killed at 140 degrees if it reaches 2 weeks worth of time period. But some weeds can survive up to 180. And so you're going to need to get to 160 to 180 to be more consistently effective at killing all weed seeds. And heat is not the only thing that you need. You need to make sure that you have some moisture involved with that heat to ensure that the death of the seed. So you need to make sure that you have a good moisture content. So one of the last things here to show about animals and weed seeds is this study that they did recently about waterfowl, geese and those kind of species. They found that 17% of the waterhemp fed to ducks were recovered in feces. All right, 17% of waterhemp, 31% of lamb's quarters, 17% of Pennsylvania smartweed, 14% Palmer amaranth, and 12% common ragweed. All right, that's a lot of weed seeds coming through those ducks. 9% of weed seeds were recovered in snow geese, were pigweeds, and 86 plants that survived, that they germinated from the seeds. 11 different species from 111 different snow geese. So 86 plants were generated from the seeds harvested from 111 snow geese. 30% of the weed seeds recovered from ducks were pigweeds. And that generated 14,000 plants of 12 different species from 238 ducks. And then 19% of the 563 plants that were grown out were water hemp seeds found in the intestines of the ducks. And so we know that that's what's happening with geese and ducks, but what about our songbirds? Can they carry and transmit just as many seeds because they're around on a more regular basis than just waiting for the geese and the ducks to come through? So here's some data. We're going to move more into management now, and I'm going to focus a lot on water hemp because, in my opinion, we need to treat water hemp like Palmer amaranth. We need to be deathly afraid of that and do everything in our power to eliminate weeds. Mark Laux has his slogan about stopping pigweeds and allowing no weed seeds, and we need to take that into account. This is the weed survey that we do on an annual basis from extension educators. Mark Laux's group does one as well. We go around and evaluate the weed control in soybean fields at the end of the season. This chart shows from 2006 to 2018 the number of weed-free mare's tail, giant ragweed, common ragweed, water hemp, and redroot pigweed at a state level. So this is an average across the whole state. You can see that the weed-free fields are hanging in there in that 28% range. They were a little bit higher in 11 and 13. You can see that we're doing a really good job. Congratulations on what we're doing with mare's tail. We're finally able to manage that one and head that thing off at the pass now, and so that's good. We only had 29% of the fields that had mare's tail this past year. One of the other weeds that are concerning to me beyond water hemp is giant ragweed, and I'll explain to you in a little bit later why I think giant ragweed is becoming such an issue, but you can see that we're on an incline for giant ragweed. And then you can see the blue area here, the water hemp in the state is continuing to increase, but at a very slow pace at the state level. I will show you now data from my particular area, the four county area of Auglaize, Darke, and Mercer counties. Here's our weed-free fields. We showed 28% at the state level, but notice Auglaize, Darke, and Shelby counties have very poor weed-free fields. Very few fields that are weed-free. This is very disheartening. Mercer County is very fortunate to have 37% of their fields weed-free. I haven't been able to figure out why Mercer County is so much better than the other three, but that's great for them to see that. And then the two weeds I want to focus on that are most concerned to me is giant ragweed and water hemp. And you can see again Mercer County has a low level of giant ragweed, but notice where the other three counties are. And so this is a lot higher numbers than what I showed you at the state level for us on our side of the state. And lastly is the water hemp. Well, we now have up to 51% of the fields in my county that are infested with water hemp now. Way too many. And for some of the areas, especially the western side of our county, we're stuck with it, and we're going to need to deal with it. The eastern side of the county, if we would get really aggressive, we could do something about it and head it off at the pass. But the western side of the county is just totally infested in reality. So that's where we're at. And you need to make sure that you understand how to identify the particular species. Again, if you treat palmer and water hemp the same, you don't need to worry about identifying them, but you need to worry about identifying it from the smooth or redroot pigweed. And the way to do that is there's no hair. No hair on the stem or the petioles of palmer and water hemp. That's what you're looking for. If you want to separate palmer from the other ones, which would be great, the petiole, which is that structure that attaches the leaf blade to the stem, is longer than what the leaf blade is. That's what we're looking for there. So again, the no hair idea is what you're looking for. And here's a nice picture here. Notice the hair on that redroot pigweed, and notice there's none on the stem of the water hemp. And this is the stage that we should be trying to identify them to know whether we need to change our herbicide program for the season. And what we're looking for here is the cotyledon shape and size. Notice the cotyledon is much wider and longer on the redroot pigweed than what it is on the waterhemp. The waterhemp is what I call an egg-shaped cotyledon, and it's much smaller. So that's the time frame we should be trying to identify it. And you can see already that the leaf blade is longer and narrower for the waterhemp compared to the redroot pigweed. This is what the flower structure looks like. Because waterhemp is dioecious, meaning we have male and female plants, you can see a little bit difference in the flowers. The female flowers here have these white structures. Those are the stigmas waiting to receive the pollen. And the male flowers are much larger because there's multiple anthers in there that are going to protrude out and produce pollen. Because waterhemp is dioecious, it has a lot of genetic diversity, and you can see that in this picture. Many different forms of seed heads. This one here looks like a smooth pigweed, but that's actually waterhemp. See how this branch is much longer, almost looks a little bit more like a palmer. And so that's what we see with the genetic diversity of waterhemp. Here is a picture of palmer. Notice how the seed branches are much thicker and much longer compared to the mare's tail. So waterhemp biology, why do we need to be concerned about it? It's an annual weed, enormous amount of genetic diversity because of being dioecious, having those male and female plants. Theoretically, every seed on a female plant could have a different male that pollinated it, right? If it's wind pollinated. Now, that's not what happens overall because the nearest male plant is going to swamp that female. But for the most part, we have a lot of mixing of genetics, and that leads to problems for this particular weed. One of the problems that it causes is an extreme length of period of germination. This thing can germinate into August, and that's not a good thing. One of the studies showed that on June 20th, only about 55% of the waterhemp had emerged. What are we doing on June 20th in a lot of cases? We're post-spraying soybeans, right? Hopefully we would have done some of it ahead of time, but a lot of us are doing it at that point in time. So you got to know how to manage those weeds that are still going to germinate after that if you're not using a product that's going to give you residual activity. So this is one of the major concerns with waterhemp is this late season germination. Another problem is it's a prolific seeder. I figure most plants are going to produce 75,000 to 100,000 seeds very quickly and easily. But you will easily get plants that produce 250,000 seeds, which is this plant here on the left-hand side. But notice this plant over here, how large it's gotten in a soybean crop, and that's 644,000 seeds. That's going to change things, your weed population, very quickly when you have that kind of weed seed production. The seed longevity isn't all that terribly long. Some people say it's only 3 to 4. Some literature shows it can be up to 10, but it's not very long compared to a lamb's quarter species, which is 100 years. And then it grows quickly, not as fast as what palmer does, but it still grows faster than most weeds. Giant ragweed, palmer, and waterhemp would be your fastest growing weeds that we would have. The season-long competition can reduce yield by 44% in soybeans. So if you do nothing, that's the kind of yield loss you're going to get. So we can certainly have yield loss. The sad part is we can even have yield loss late in the season. If something germinates at the V5 stage, so you got 4 trifoliates at that point in time, you can have yield loss yet if the waterhemp are coming in at that point in time. So that's a concern. Herbicides are generally less effective for waterhemp, which is one of the issues that we have. And lastly, the most concerning part and why you never want waterhemp is because of resistance. And again, the genetic diversity in this species makes sure that we're going to have resistance. So you can see how many numbers do we have up there? for Missouri? 6 for Missouri, right? So in one plant you have resistance to 6 different sites of action. That's what those numbers refer to. What's a group 2 herbicide? Those are your ALS products like Pursuit. Doesn't work. Group 4. What's a group 4 herbicide? There's the growth regulators, right? 2,4-D, dicamba. So we have 2,4-D resistance in Waterhemp, not dicamba resistance. Do you think we'll get dicamba resistance? Absolutely. And I'll give you a little story to prove that it will happen. Because in North Dakota, where they have a weed called kochia, somewhat similar to lamb's quarter, in cereal crops, those spring crops, they have to deal with annual weeds like we do in corn and soybean production. And they were using 2,4-D to control kochia in that wheat. Guess what happened? It quit working. What do you think they switched to? Dicamba. What do you think happened to dicamba? It quit working. Used a product called Star Rain, which we don't use too much here. Guess what happened to that? Quit working. Once you get resistance to one of the growth regulators, you increase your risk of resistance to the next growth regulator. So we will get resistance to dicamba at some point in time if we use it too often. Group number 9 is what herbicide? Glyphosate. Group 14 is what? The PPO inhibiting herbicides, Flexstar, Cobra, Ultra Blazer. And the group 27 is what? Your HPPD inhibitors, Callisto, Impact, Lotus, the new Shield X herbicide. So if one plant has resistance to all of those herbicides, what's left? Glufosinate, Liberty. That's it. Post-emergence. We're down to one product in that particular field. And so one of the strategies we've been using is to go after these water hemp with group 15 herbicides. What's a group 15 herbicide? Dual, Warrant in soybeans, Zidua, Outlook. Guess what's happened in Illinois now? We have resistance to the group 15s now. That was our saving grace. Now we're done. All right? We have very few options. So make sure that we are able to utilize or extend the period of life of Extend soybeans, of 2,4-D soybeans, the utility of these group 15 herbicides. Let's not overuse these things and get us into more problems, or even Liberty, because we will get resistance. Because in my research plots with water hemp, I can have plants survive Liberty and dicamba in my plots. They don't do very well. They only produce a few seeds, but that will change over time to be more resistant. So we've got to be very careful about this weed and why you don't want that weed. So how are we going to manage water hemp? Here's one of the studies I've been working on. This is Liberty Link soybeans. Looked at different pre-herbicides. No residual Valor XLT, which is Valor and Classic at 4 ounces. Valor XLT plus Metribuzin at 8 ounces. The Fierce XLT, which is Valor XLT plus Zidua. Wanted to see once if having 3 active ingredients would do much better. And then the Valor XLT, followed by this idea of layering of pre's, going back out with another group 15 herbicide like Zidua in this case to see once what would happen. And then we had 2 different timings because we wanted to see once if the plants would be less controlled at a larger size. So what happened between these 2 dates? In 17 and 18, if I combine the data between 17 and 18, you can see that statistically There was no difference to the pre's, although the Fierce XLT did tend to provide more effective control. So the residual is helping us out. You'll see that in the next slide. But that's one of the strategies, is to use add metribuzin helped a little bit. Going to Fierce XLT helped also. But again, not statistically. What happens if we put a post-emergence application of Liberty? What's it going to look like at the end of the season? And you can see that the Zidua, the Fierce XLT and the Valor XLT followed by Zidua gave us the most effective control. Notice that Liberty did not clean all of the Valor XLT water hemp up. And notice the other issue here is you do not want to control water hemp with Liberty alone without a pre-emergence herbicide. You're not going to get it done, because you're going to get germination after that Liberty application or not get all plants controlled, and you're going to have issues. So you have to have a pre-emergence herbicide to manage water hemp effectively. Then at the bottom, notice I did add one treatment where I had FlexStar with Liberty with no residual chemistry down, and we could maintain control with that FlexStar because it gave us some residual activity. So that is another strategy. You're going to add injury to the soybean because of the FlexStar, but that is an option, although again I don't like to go in without a pre-herbicide. The one part of this data set I hate showing is the timing. Notice how there was no difference between whether I went 3 to 4 or 6 to 8. I don't encourage a 6 to 8 inch application, but we were able to make that work in this research. I'd much rather see that 3 to 4 or 4 to 6 inch timing for the Liberty. Here's my study for group 15s. This is the first year I've done this in 2018. What I did was use Dual 2 Magnum. Remember that Dual 2 Magnum is the S-metolachlor product. S-metolachlor is supposed to be more effective than the R isomer of metolachlor. Then I used Parallel, which is the old Dual. So you have R and S isomers in there pretty much equally. So theoretically, it's supposed to be less effective. You'll see once in the data whether it is or not. Outlook at 18 fluid ounces. Warrant at 1.5 quarts. And then Zidua at 2.5. I did this pre, and then I came back post, like that last study where I put the Zidua in post. I wanted to see which of these products post-emergence would work the best as well. But I lost my data, because for the first time that I have sprayed Liberty, it failed. And so if I didn't get all the plants killed before I put the group 15s on, I didn't know whether or not there was more germination afterwards or not. But I do have some injury data to show you on those post treatments. So what was the effect? What was the water hemp control here on 625 before I made my Liberty application? And you can see that the Zidua was way ahead of all of the other products. Warrant was number 2, and the other 3 pretty much fell in line with each other. You can see the grass control in the next column. Again, the Zidua performed better. So what happened with the control after my Liberty application? And what was surprising to me, even though we only had about 55% control out of the metolachlor and Outlook, we were still able to get effective control at the end of the season with the Liberty application. So we can clean up something that looks pretty bad with the Liberty application. But again, that Zidua was 100% because it was so effective to begin with. The Liberty cleaned what little up was there. The injury, there is some injury that we have to deal with these products going post-emergence. Zidua and the metolachlor products are going to cause the most injury. This is a transient injury. It's not something that I'm worried about, but some of you may get nervous about that. It's not going to reduce yield, but it is certainly there. Certainly if you're expecting no injury from a Liberty or a glyphosate application. And this particular study, because I had that poor control with the Liberty to start with, after my second application, I only got 91% control. So if you don't get the plants controlled with Liberty the first time around, you're not going to get all of them controlled with a second application either. But it did do a pretty good job. We did go from 59% to 91%. So it was pretty good, but not perfect. So what are the strategies to summarize the Waterhemp studies that I did? I lay out 3 different strategies for you. I don't know whether you need that many, but I'll give you 3 different options. Number 1 is to go after it with the most pre-emergence products that you can. Kind of like that Valor, the Fierce XLT, where you have 2 or 4 or more active ingredients in there that are going to be effective. And then you come back with 1 post-emergence application. The things that you have to remember is that going with a very high rate of the soil-applied herbicide, you cause your chances for risk for injury to be greater. All right? And we saw that this past year. Injury was pretty high on soybean fields this past year. The other thing is because that Waterhemp germinates later, there's no way to guarantee not having a second post application. You may still need that. So make sure you scout and look for that. The other strategy is to put any pre down you want. Dual, Valor XLT, Fierce XLT, whatever you want to choose, and come back with 2 post-emergence applications. Just plain for 2 posts. There's some problems though with that strategy. One is resistance, right? Because you're likely to use the same post-emergence product over again. So you're going to push that envelope for resistance with this particular strategy. Secondly, if you're going to make those 2 post applications, you have some issues and with timing of those. You're going to have to spray early if you're going to do 2 post applications, because you have to be done at R1 for Liberty, Dicamba, and FlexStar. How many of you guys are still spraying after R1? Unfortunately, many of us are. We're supposed to be done. All right? The only product that's going to give you a little wider window is the Enlist system. You can go to R2 there. So if you're going to do this strategy legally, you need to be spraying pretty early, and R1 may be a little bit too early yet sometimes to preclude having that second germination period. So what's another strategy? And lastly, the third strategy is pre-emergence, whatever you want. Come back with an effective post-emergence herbicide like 2,4-D, Dicamba, FlexStar, Liberty, and then you come back and you put a residual group 15 herbicide with that application. So you put a Zidua or a Dual or an Outlook or a Warrant with that application. Just remember, will Dual or Zidua kill a plant that's already emerged? No. So you have to make sure. Once I've laid out this type of strategy, and some people say, well, I'm just still going to use my Roundup Ready soybeans and spray glyphosate only. What happens if you have glyphosate resistant weeds out there? They're going to be left behind because the Dual is not going to kill those particular products, those particular weeds. So what kind of pre's should I be using? The base program starts with flumioxazin or sulfentrazone. One of those 2, you choose them. Nextly, you can look at metribuzin as an option. Add that into the mix. Then you can add a group 15 in. There is one warning that I have to give you, is that you cannot use metolachlor or Outlook with flumioxazin or Valor. All right? Because the injury is way too great. You cannot do that. You can add any of these with sulfentrazone, interestingly, but you can't put metolachlor or Outlook with the flumioxazin or Valor. And then the last product we could use is the old pendimethalin. That's another option, but the pendimethalin is not going to be any more effective than what the Dual is going to give you 50 to 70% control, and that's about it. So those are the pre's to look at. Post-emergence, you can use glyphosate, but many of our populations have resistance in it, especially if you're getting it in a new area. It's probably being carried in somewhere that already has the resistance. You can use fomisafen or lactofen. The problem is that we have resistance. We know in the state of Ohio we have three-way resistance. Group 2, Group 14, and Group 9. All right? So you have to be careful about the fomisafen and lactofen not working. I know that in certain areas of the state, that's a big issue. In my area, 8 of the fields that were tested, 8 of 8 fields that I tested last summer turned out to be resistant to the PPO herbicides. So that's a major concern. Glufosinate, there's no resistance in dicamba. They're not perfect, but again, I already alluded to, in Missouri, they have 2,4-D resistant water hemp. So we have to be careful about using that. We don't have resistance to that here yet, but that certainly is a possibility. So those are the post products to choose from. Limitations with these residual herbicides I mentioned, you're going to have to spray early. How many of you are spraying at third trifoliate soybeans? If you're going to do this residual program, you're going to have to get used to doing that. That's the timing that those products can be utilized. Outlook and Parallel are 5th trifoliate and warrants R2. The last caution that you have here is the maximum dosage of these products that you can be used for the whole season. I really would like to see something like Zidua says 3.5 ounces. I really would like to see 2.5 ounces out early and another 2 ounces out later. That puts you out over 3.5, right? So you can't do that. So what you're going to have to do, especially for Zidua, is starting to mix and match. Maybe use Zidua pre and come back with metolachlor post-emergence. So you're going to have to mix and match if you're going to push these rates up to the higher rate range. So just one overarching example here. What I think would be the best program would be a Fierce XLT or Authority Supreme plus first rate. And then you come back with Liberty or dicamba plus glyphosate or Flexstar plus glyphosate or the Enlist plus glyphosate. And then you add Warrant or Zidua post-emergence. That's the program that I think is the best. Again, you can choose, there's many pre's, but I think those are probably the better pre's for the water hemp. All right, we need to eliminate by identifying, don't let any plants produce seeds, and if we're not careful, we're going to reduce our profits. What's this weed? Giant ragweed. I don't think this weed comes in our feed and into the manure very often, but certainly a weed that I said was problematic. Why is it difficult to manage? It is a very genetically diverse also because it's monoecious. What does monoecious mean? You have male and female flowers that are on the same plant, but they're separated from the plant. What do we grow that looks like that? Corn, right? You got the ear and the tassel. The ragweed is the same way, both of them. You got the top part of the plant that has the pollen, and down where the nodes are, where the leaves are, that's where you see the seeds. And so you have to have pollen moving around. The other thing that makes genetic diversity great in this species is it's non-compatible. So the pollen from that particular plant will not effectively pollinate the seeds from that same plant. You have to have pollen from another plant. So that creates a lot of genetic diversity and causes issues. And one of the issues is, like with water hemp, is this germination period. The germination period on giant ragweed is continuing to extend. We're getting it to germinate into July, and that's causing us some major issues with managing this particular weed. There are too few herbicides that we have effective in soybeans. We don't have enough tools there, especially pre-emergence. I'll point that out in a little bit. The timing of the post-herbicides, we're going out there when they're 10 or 12 inches tall instead of 6 to 8 inches tall, and that's another one of our problems. And then we have resistance. We have resistance to group 2, group 9, and group 14. So how many post-herbicides are left to manage this one? Liberty, 2,4-D, and dicamba. Those are the only herbicides we have left to always manage the weeds. Not all of our populations have group 14 resistance to Flexstar, but we're gaining in that, especially if you talk to those individuals that are growing non-GMO beans. They're having a lot harder time controlling the giant ragweed. So, strategies in soybeans. Well, we need to have a pre followed by 2 post applications. If you don't have 2 post applications, you're not going to get it to work. Why do we have to have 2 post applications? It's because our pre is not working very well anymore. The most effective way to control giant ragweed pre-emergence is with Classic, First Rate, Scepter, and a little bit of Pursuit. What do we know is wrong? What is happening in giant ragweed populations? Resistance to group 2 herbicides. Those are all group 2 herbicides. That's why you're continuing to see more plants at the post-emergence timing, because we're selecting for those ALS-resistant giant ragweeds. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we're having problems with giant ragweed at the end of the season, is because our pre is not working. Because we don't have anything else left. Flumioxazin and metribuzin and sulfentrazone, those are the only things we have left. Sulfentrazone is a complete goose egg, and Valor and metribuzin is pretty close to a goose egg. So this is why we've got major issues with giant ragweed, because we can't get our pre-herbicides to work. But you still need to utilize, despite that resistance, keep using the Classic and the First Rate, because there are still some plants that are susceptible, and we're getting those ones controlled at least. And then post-emergence, we've got fomasafen or lactofen. Fomasafen or Flexstar would be a little more effective than lactofen, but we still have resistance to deal with, so we're not going to kill all plants in all fields. We've got First Rate that pretty much isn't going to work anymore. Then we've got glufosinate, dicamba, and 2,4-D. Those are really the only 3 products that are going to guarantee to work on giant ragweed anymore. Again, this is why, in my opinion, Roundup 2 and Roundup 1 soybeans are worthless anymore. We need to be growing Extend, 2,4-D, or Liberty soybeans unless you really know your weed population and don't have the resistance that I say you can have. How many of you growing non-GMO soybeans? A few of you in here. The strategy there is to use as much First Rate as possible, up to 0.6 to 3/4 of an ounce of First Rate. Chlorimiron, you could increase the rate, but then you got to worry about carryover and then injury to the soybeans. So First Rate would be a safer way to go pre-emergence. Again, you're not going to get all plants controlled, but then what you're going to have to go with is the old tried and true method of Basagran plus Flexstar. Basagran plus Flexstar. That's what we're going to have to go with. 1 pint of Basagran, 0.65 pints of Flexstar, plus an MSO at 1.5 pints per acre, plus ammonium sulfate on 3 to 4 inch giant ragweed, and automatically 2 weeks later you come back in and do the same thing over again. That's the best strategy you've got in non-GMO soybeans. Okay? Giant ragweed in corn. You got 2 strategies here that you can implement. One is pre followed by post, and we need to make sure that we're always getting our giant ragweed controlled in the corn, because we have more effective products there, and we don't want any seeds to go over into the soybean crop to cause us more issues. We want some type of a comprehensive pre-program, basing it on atrazine at 1.6 to 2 pints, 2 quarts per acre, depending upon whether you have highly erodible soils. And then you add with it Balance, Callisto, Stinger, or Acuron. Acuron has atrazine in it, so you have to fix your ratio there to make sure you're not using anything more. But Those are the best ways to go after it, a comprehensive pre. And then you come back post. I prefer something like Status and Diflex. That's dicamba to go after the giant ragweed. But you could choose Diflex Duo, which is Lotus plus dicamba. And then I'd add some atrazine in there because of the Lotus. Or you could select Impact, Lotus, Callisto, Shield X, or atrazine. If you choose the latter ones there, what's going to happen? If we're putting down group 27 herbicides pre-emergence, what's going to happen if we come back with group 27 post-emergence? We're going to get resistance. All right? That's why I kind of like the dicamba, and that's why using dicamba soybeans then is a little bit of an issue. We're going to cause dicamba resistance. So we've got to use our herbicides very wisely for giant ragweed between corn and soybeans. The other strategy is to go early post. You could go really early post with a Corvus plus atrazine at a high rate on corn that's less than V2. Or you can wait till the giant ragweed gets 3 to 4 inches tall, or maybe 4 to 6 on less than 12-inch corn, and come out with Caprino, Resicor. There's some other combinations like the Lotus or Impact plus atrazine or Acuron. But you got to be concerned about timing so that you don't lose yield. The more giant ragweed you have, the more chance you have to lose yield. So you have to be careful of that. Giant ragweed is our greatest competitor of any of the crops that we have. So we have to be concerned about that. So timing is very important. What's this particular weed? Lamb's quarter, right? This is certainly a weed that I showed earlier that can be in our manure because it's in the feed samples. So we need to be concerned about this particular weed also. In soybeans, I really would recommend a pre followed by post program to manage it most effectively. But in a lot of cases, we can get by with a pre-emergence herbicide for the season for lamb's quarters unless you have populations that know how to germinate later in the season. And the one reason why we don't have the amount of water hemp that we once did in Roundup Ready soybeans is because we switched to pre-emergence products. And pretty much all the pre-emergence products are a 9 in the weed control guide, except for metolachlor, Boundary, Outlook, pendimethalin, Prefix, Warrant, and Zidua. So all of the other products are going to work. All right? Those are the only ones that are not going to give you perfect control of lamb's quarters. And that's why we see the effective lamb's quarter control that we are, because we're going to those pre-emergence herbicides. What do you have for post-emergence in soybeans? You've got dicamba, 2,4-D, glyphosate at a high rate, Harmony, and Raptor. So we do have a few more products post-emergence to manage lamb's quarters than what we do with water hemp and giant ragweed. So lamb's quarters is a concern to be managing it, but it's a lot easier to manage with the herbicides we have available compared to giant ragweed and water hemp. Not quite as challenging. Lamb's quarters in corn, again, I would recommend a pre followed by post program. The pre is still the same. Pretty much anything will work with the exception of metolachlor, acetochlor, Outlook, Anthem, Max, Resolve, pendimethalin, and Zidua. Pretty much everything else is a 9. And then post-emergence, you can see in corn we have more products available to us. 2,4-D, glyphosate, bromoxynil, Impact, Lotus, Callisto, Shield X, and Caprino. Dicamba is just a touch lower than that, so it didn't show up on the list there. What's this weed? Velvet leaf. This is another weed that certainly has been shown to be prevalent in manure because of being in feed products. So this is a concern also to manage, but it's pretty easy to manage, similar to lamb's quarter. You can see now we have fewer products. We don't have a long list of products to use pre-emergence, but we have some. Command, Latier, Panther Pro, and Zidua Pro will control velvet leaf pre-emergence. And then if we go post-emergence, we have lots of options. We've got Cadet, Extreme, First Rate, Glyphosate at a high rate, like Lamb's Quarters that takes a high rate, Pursuit, Raptor, and Resource. So we have plenty of tools available to manage the velvet leaf in soybeans. And for corn, same thing. I want to pre followed by post. We've got lots of options pre-emergence, and we've got lots of options post-emergence. So there's no reason why we should have any velvet leaf left in cornfields. So with that, Glenn, I'm done.